I'm not a big fan of waiting. When it comes to waiting, I only like two things: now and right now. I think it's safe to say that I absolutely hate the in-between of any kind. All of us know how it feels to wait. And if you're anything like me, you aren't really comfortable waiting very long. Some of you might be in the middle of waiting for something right now. And when you're waiting, it feels like you exist in this weird in-between time. The time in your story when something in your life is happening and you have no idea how things are going to turn out. Honestly, that can make us feel uneasy, confused, or just plain discouraged.
Maybe you've been struggling with some drama in your friend group and you keep waiting for it to go away or get better, but it hasn't yet. And right now you aren't sure if you'll ever get to a place where you can all be friends again. Or maybe you made a mistake, a choice you aren't proud of, and you wish you could take it back. The in-between for you pretty much feels like the end of the world. You're waiting for it to blow over, waiting to get past this and get your life back, or at least just your screen time back. But you just don't know when and how that will happen.
Some of you might be in the middle of waiting to see if you're gonna get the grade that you've been working so hard for. Or maybe your mom or dad lost a job and you don't know how long it'll be until they find another one. Or maybe you're waiting to hear the results of a medical diagnosis for someone in your family. That kind of waiting, the kind where you don't know what the future will be like, is incredibly hard, isn't it?
No matter what it is you're waiting for, I think we can all agree that the waiting, the in-between time in our stories, just isn't that much fun. In fact, it feels pretty terrible. When you're in the middle of your story and can't see how it's going to work out, it's easy to feel stuck in discouragement and defeat. You can't possibly see a happy ending from where you're standing, and you don't know what to do next. It's confusing, complicated, and sometimes just completely hopeless. And when we feel this way, it's easy to think that the story is over. It's easy to believe that whatever pain we're feeling or circumstances we're in can't possibly get better.
But I have good news for you. It's not over. How do I know? Well, for starters, because I've felt stuck and discouraged in the waiting too. I know how it feels, but I also know that because of Jesus, we don't have to stay in the waiting. We're in the middle of celebrating the Easter season at church right now. And if you know anything about Easter, besides bunnies and eggs and chocolates, of course, then you know it's a time when we as a church remember and recognize the death and resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, we really believe Jesus came back from the dead, which I, for one, think is a pretty cool move.
Back in the day, when Jesus was here on earth, there was a group of people who gave up everything they had to follow him. These guys were known as disciples. They were so sure that Jesus was who he said he was that they walked away from their jobs, gave up their cozy lifestyles, and stepped away from everything they knew to follow him.
But then something terrible happened. Jesus was thrown in jail and sentenced to death. You might be thinking, why would anyone throw Jesus in jail? Well, it was because he claimed to not only be able to forgive people for their sins, but he also claimed to be God himself. This really upset the religious leaders and government officials of that time. You see, we know that Jesus was actually telling the truth about all that God stuff, but some people back then just didn't understand that yet. So Jesus was crucified, put to death on a cross in front of everyone, even though he did nothing wrong.
Historically, Christians around the world remember and reflect on the death of Jesus on what's called Good Friday. Even though death isn't typically a good thing, we call it Good Friday because we know how the story turns out. We know that Jesus died, but we also know that after 3 days, he came back to life. But for the followers of Jesus who were there on the day he was crucified, that Friday felt anything but good. It was probably the worst day of their lives. All of those people who gave up everything to follow Jesus were left wondering what to do next. Their leader, the man they believed was the Son of God, was gone, and they were left in the middle of the story.
You see, there's a gap between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, a time when the disciples were left in the waiting and the pain. Jesus had just died, and the disciples didn't know what was gonna happen because they were in the middle of the story. They were living in the present, the now. And they had to live through the story in order to know how things would turn out in the future. To them, the time between Jesus' death and resurrection, the in-between time, may have very well felt like the end of the world. It probably felt like it would last forever.
That's where we pick up the story in the book of John. Jesus' disciples were hiding in the upper room with the doors locked. For those of you who are wondering, an upper room is basically just a private room that's located in an upper story of a building. So the disciples were in the upper room. Jesus was gone and they were left alone without him. They were afraid that what happened to Jesus might also happen to them. But then, in the middle of the mess, in the middle of the doubt and heartbreak, in the middle of the bolted doors and fear for their lives, guess who showed up? Let's take a look at the book of John to find out. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said.
That's right, Jesus showed up. The guy the disciples saw crucified and buried just days before was suddenly standing there in the room with them. Pretty crazy, right? In the middle of their fears and despair, just when they thought their story was over, Jesus showed up. And he literally came back to show them that the story wasn't over. He was still working in the in-between, and look at what Jesus told them. Peace be with you.
Jesus not only showed up to tell the disciples that the story wasn't finished, but he showed up to bring them peace. He wanted them to know that even in the middle of so much uncertainty, even when the disciples didn't know how the story was going to end, Jesus came to show them that peace was possible. Jesus showed them that he mattered in their stories. And the same is true for us. When we feel hopeless, alone, and afraid, Jesus wants us to know that because of him, peace is possible. Because of him, the story isn't over.
Here's the truth. Jesus matters in your story. The in-between for you might be ending soon, or what you're waiting for could be really far away, or maybe you don't even know what's coming in the future. I may not know what exactly you're waiting for or how long you'll be waiting, but what I do know is this. When Jesus steps into the in-between with us, the story we thought might be over is really just beginning.
I don't know exactly what you're waiting for, but what I do know is that when you're waiting in the in-between, those are the places Jesus wants to come into your life. If you're stuck in the agonizing wait for things to get better, that's exactly the right time for Jesus to enter your story. When you want to turn and run the most, that's when Jesus wants to walk right in with enough peace to get you through to the other side of the story.
You guys, God loves you, and he is for you, and he wants the best for you. And that's why Jesus matters in your story. He's there to bring healing and hope right in the middle of doubts, questions, and fears. And all we have to do is open the door and invite him in.
Inviting him in means believing right now in your heart and mind that Jesus is who he said he was, the Son of God, and that he came to earth and was crucified to show us that God loves us and forgives us even when we make mistakes.
For some of you, this makes total sense. You know exactly what it feels like to be in the middle of waiting, and you're ready to invite Jesus into it, to pray and ask for his peace. Maybe you've already done this before and you've experienced the peace Jesus provides during difficult times. That's awesome.
But maybe for you, you've asked Jesus into your life, but you're still feeling uneasy or sad or frustrated. And I get it. That happens to me sometimes. Like, Jesus is a part of my life in a big way. But sometimes I still feel stuck in situations or in feelings that aren't all that great. But you know what is great? Jesus is still there no matter what. So be patient, because he's still working on your story. You just might not be able to see how it's going to turn out yet.
And then, for some of you, this may be harder to understand. Some of you aren't even sure if you believe this whole Easter story is even real. That's okay. To you, I would say, just be open. Be open to the idea that Jesus might surprise you. Be open to the idea that Jesus might show up and change your story.
So if today you decided to invite Jesus into your heart to be part of your story, I want to say, 1, that's the best decision you've ever made. 2, tell someone. Tell your small group leader, or your parent, because this is something we're celebrating.
And listen, if today you feel like you now have even more questions about Jesus, to you, I say this. Number 1, that's awesome. Ask as many questions as you have. And number 2, ask someone. Ask someone you trust to help you work through your questions and doubts or your confusion. Because Jesus matters in your story, even when you aren't sure how it's gonna end. So as you leave, here's a question I want you to think about. Is there something in your life that you're waiting for right now?